Fantastic. Okay, well, today I am really pleased to welcome Joe David to the podcast. Joe, you are a services procurement and contingent workforce subject matter expert. We've known each other for a little while, kind of spoken through kind of work opportunities and been
Right.
involved in the same sort of conferences and stuff like that. And I know you've been just been off on adventures, which we can talk about in a minute, but I'm so pleased to get you on the podcast, and I'm really, really looking forward to hearing your point of view. So, firstly, welcome and thanks very much for joining me.
Yeah, absolutely, John. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Excellent stuff. So, one of the things that I know is a deep area of operational expertise within services procurement for you is, or a deep area of expertise, is the operational side of it.
That's right.
And I really want to kind of touch on that in some of the topics we're going to be talking about today as a particular kind of focus. But there's loads of cool services procurement stuff for us to discuss. You've been involved in some really groundbreaking work in this area, I think it's fair to say, over the last few years. And just to give anyone who was watching this who maybe doesn't already know you, um, just an understanding of your background and what you've been doing, would you be able to kind of like summarize your journey in this area, kind of how you got into it, what was your background prior to this, and what's it been like kind of going through the journey?
Yeah, absolutely. I was happy to talk because it was very it's a circuitous path to get to services procurement. But I started in the staffing industry. This was about 21 years ago, with one of the largest privately owned staffing companies in the United States. And actually, I had a very interesting start. I actually started out as a bids manager, so I actually helped with proposal responses for staffing contracts. As I had graduated just a year before from the University of Maryland with an English degree, I was just incredibly excited to get a job that had an actual application of my degree at that point. But quite frankly, I had no idea what the company really did until I kind of got into the meat of what staffing was all about. So I actually did that for 2 years, and then I had great leaders at the time that actually encouraged me to make the leap into actually doing staffing directly with the organization. So I actually made a move from the East Coast United States to the West Coast to San Francisco. And then I did recruiting for accounting and finance and mortgage skill sets for almost about 2 years. And then from there, that's when my journey into MSP, the managed service space, came in. I had a great boss from my original role that asked me to join at that point, one of the lead, it is still the leading MSP, to actually run a managed service program for a financial institution out in Washington, D.C. So we came back to the East Coast, and that's really where my journey as an operator in the MSP space really started. So that was about like 2007. And then from there, that was my career for the majority of it. I ran a variety of programs, started out as an individual contributor, but then very soon became a leader for large financial MSPs, actually doing global rollouts. And then I moved back to the West Coast to do some other leadership in managed service programs. And basically, in all of those, more than half of those programs had at least some sort of services procurement component. And actually, the first program I joined back in 2007, 2008, we actually launched one of the first service procurement programs. Although at that point, people didn't call it that. That was just an add-on service. It didn't have a name to it, services procurement. So really my journey in service procurement started off with having that baseline, but then really having a flavor of that as I continued to evolve and grow in operations, leading many global accounts and doing many service procurement deployments. And then for the past 5 years at my past employer, I was actually a leader of the product. So basically called service procurement or procurement solutions, really led the product and its strategy, its growth and really its evolution. And to your point, we did a lot of really cool things, especially working with enabled AI technologies to really provide some new services, but really just helping to deploy some even more complex and interesting services programs around the world.
Yeah, it's interesting listening to you talk about those early programs because like 2007, I mean that's really early for these type of programs.
Yes.
So did that was like an add-on. Did it actually have a name or was it just was it just like seen as some weird random add-on?
Yeah, it was. It really started off truly as almost. It really was an add-on. We deployed it with one of the leading VMS technologies, and they had just rolled out what they called basically like a headcount tracking module in addition to
Okay.
the staff augmentation module, and that was kind of the first functionality of just like managing headcounts. And then with that client, based on their need, they rolled out this very complex and comprehensive staff augmentation managed service program But at that point, this organization did recognize they had thousands of other workers that didn't fit in the staff augmentation bucket that were under outsource agreements and statements of work. And they wanted to get at least some baseline visibility. And then at that time, there wasn't a technology in the VMSs that were going to manage the statements of work themselves. It really was at that point just going to be the headcount. So just getting a basic idea of the people, the supplier they're with, maybe getting some baseline tied to the statement of work that they're supposed to be supporting. And that's actually what we first launched with. But then that was really right at the time where that same VMS provider was also developing an actual services procurement module. And so then a couple of years later, they deployed a true statement of work module, and then we deployed that with that customer. So we were able to evolve that baseline headcount tracking solution into actually managing the statements of work in there. But I'd say it's interesting. We manage those statements of work, but I'd even say at that point when we managed SOWs in the program, I would still say it was very much still considered more of an administrative program. It was really just to eliminate the need to get statements of work on paper, getting it within the VMS, and just basically being the payments function for these SOW-based workers. The whole idea of capturing analytics around projects, it's a really good supplier performance data. The things that we talk about now industry really wasn't a thing at that point, or at least the expectation wasn't there for services. So it was really interesting to start off with a program that at that time was leading. But, now if we think about what we did back then, it really is now what I consider a very baseline service. So it's been really cool to see the evolution, to your earlier point, of the customers' needs and desires to get more out of services procurements and get really more of that great data that you can capture to really make those really informed buying decisions.
This is why I was so looking forward to getting you on the podcast because I think this is fascinating because there's not really many people who've been in the position that you've been in to be involved in these like genuinely like real leading edge programs from way early on. And I mean, it's interesting because that what out of interest, what was the key driver for that company? Was it a misclassification concern or was it just general? Someone had said, "Who are these workers? I want to know who they are."
Yeah, it was very much baseline visibility. I think the idea of classification, I think it certainly was a concern back then, but I think it didn't have the same amount of knowledge of the risk as it does now. I think if I remember, we definitely had some situations where we could move some of the work into staff augmentation, but it was very ones or twos. I think at that point, this is the mid 2000s, that type of supplier, there was still very much this mystique because it's mostly like IT professional services companies
Right.
that while they wanted to get the baseline visibility, they didn't want to shake that relationship too much. And this
Yeah.
is meaning our sponsors, because, for the most part, these are like very large agreements and they tend to have very executive level relationships. So anything that was perceived as too much of a disruption to either the business or a threat to the supplier, it was very precious at that time. So we really had to be careful about that. And quite honestly, I don't even think the idea of doing more was really in anyone's head because they knew that those relationships would be hard to overcome. And I'll bring up now because that was then. Now, in the industry, all those types of suppliers are very much in services procurement. But I think it's that evolution of the supplier's appetite for joining the programs. Probably the more important one is the buyers, right? And the sponsors. Sophistication, understanding that yes, those type of suppliers do agree to come to these programs, and also just getting more, higher within the business and showing the business case of a service procurement program to executives to help executive be your advocate to drive these types of suppliers into service procurement programs. Because ultimately, that executive sponsorship is just a critical part of making these programs successful back then and certainly now.
100%. This just throws up so many questions for me because the crazy thing is when you look at the kind of like maturity spectrum, even now, there are some organizations that are in exactly the position you're just describing. Back in 2007, that was fully leading edge. Right now, they're like lagging. But there are lots of big companies that are in that position, and that's their kind of thought process around it now, which is crazy when you realize that at the far sophisticated end of it, there are people doing genuine sourcing, AI enabled front
Exactly.
end and really sophisticated capture of back end data, supplier performance analysis, forward planning, capability horizon planning, all that sort of good stuff. So it's really evolved, but it's crazy to think that's almost 20 years ago. And there's still plenty of companies who are that's still where they've got to, which is
Yeah.
pretty crazy. It is starting to move forward rapidly. But when you mentioned about the executive support, the other thing that brings to mind is I've kind of had this approach for quite a while that really, when I'm talking to people about this who are potentially looking to solve this problem, I'm looking to, it's not necessarily like a particular sector or a particular region or a particular type of company. It's definitely obviously larger companies, it's not tiny organizations.
Sure. Yeah.
But for me, the thing that stands out is where you get a person or a department or a group of stakeholders who just say, this isn't good enough, we can do it better. Or there's a strong driver where they say, we've got this risk and we've got to sort this out. And we talk about those people as being the enlightened ones when it comes to services procurement. In your experience, has the people in the organizations who've got the momentum, the executive sign-off, the business case, the kind of the motivation and compulsion to really move on this, has it been tied to any particular sectors, locations, type of company, that sort of thing?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think it's I don't think it's any specific industry that has a monopoly on, wanting to start in services at a higher level of sophistication. I think it really just depends on the organization and the dynamics. Obviously in MSPs, managed service providers, the sponsorship, right? The key sponsor has always been either HR, procurement, sometimes both. And those leaders are great, and I know they're trying to move the needle, but I think ultimately, those departments also have their own internal clients, and those end up being the business. So from my perspective, especially most recently, the thing that's been really heartening to see is that outside of the procurement and HR sponsorship, circles, I've seen business owners start understanding the service procurement space more and the value that can join. So, like an example, just last year, I was working with a retail provider here in the Portland area, and the person that identified a need to manage service procurement was not in procurement. She wasn't in HR. She was actually within the IT organization, but
Right.
essentially kind of like a process excellence, almost kind of like a vendor manager. And it was her and having that direct line to the CTO and identifying, hey, there's something here that's not right. Their procurement HR groups are providing great, valuable service, but also she was actually the owner of these IT supplier relationships and seeing day to day and her team dealing with the issues of not tying workers to SOWs, issues with payments. When her CTO asked me, hey, this big IT outsourcer, like, where are all their people at? And she's not having an answer. She actually was able to look at, hey, the staff log MSP that exists has all this data. Why can't I get this for this population I actually more directly manage? So through credit for her, she actually helped with making those connections. We worked with her for actually developing a business case. And I think in my experience, that was one of the fastest platforms to get directly to the CTO because of the fact that she was already ingrained within the business. And I say this not to downplay the role of our sponsors and HR and procurement. They obviously are very important, and certainly there's CPOs, CHROs that care about this could also, move the needle as quickly as that. But I think it's a really good example, whether you're provider side or within the sponsorship circles, of just ensuring that you solicit that business owner, right, and getting those advocates. Because especially in the service procurement space, like you really need that, like the actual end business owner to really want and need the solution to make that business case and deployment of the solution much more effective.
Yeah, it's definitely, I agree with you. It's definitely something that, for example, we as a business, as a tech provider in the space, we've learned over time. If you're trying to approach companies to solve problems and, make procurement's life easier and make things, people don't care. Companies, they should care more about procurement, but there's almost like a bigger issue to consider here, which is what about the buyer? What about
Yeah.
the organization? So the organization needs to engage these services so that they can deliver their product or service to the market. It's a
Yes.
decent chunk of how they get their work done, isn't it? So actually, we always say making it easier, safer, faster for the people that need to buy the services to do it and have value in mind, because that is the actual business driver, really, isn't it?
100%. Yeah. And I think with that, a key thing is then actually getting and understanding the business's key pain points, right? And then creating a solution that is specific to their needs. And that can be different from organization to organization. And I bring it up because I know from, MSP space, from our HR procurement sponsors, you mentioned, the idea of classification, first. Like I think we in the, services procurement staffing industry, like we understand like workforce classification, our sponsors do as well too. But I think it's hard and challenging to then go to an IT business owner or a marketing director and tell you, hey, this way that you've been doing business all the time, it's not correct. And I'm going to force you into either picking deliverable milestone or it needs to be staff augmentation. Obviously, there are some companies that have enough of a sway within the sponsorship organizations to make the type of change happen. But what I found is a lot of times you have to meet the business where they're at, right? So you have to create a custom solution that still drives, a lot of the goals of a MSP program or using a technology to help guide the right buying behaviors and classification. But a lot of times you need to start off with maybe it's a more hybrid solution. Maybe you allow, for example, maybe some T&M based statements of work and making sure it's not misclassified, but in turn, there's some other risk mitigation points. Maybe there's like a holdback in the statement of work or something else that the supplier is taking on some risk. So it's not purely just a veiled staff augmentation play. And I only say that because that could be at least oh yeah, yeah, I'll say the word compromise, but something to meet the business where they're at to at least get that into the program. And then once you get in the program, you can use that data to help really make those transformational changes, like maybe truly then mandating anything under statement work has to be deliverable. It'll be a journey, right? But a lot of times you have to get people in first, right? To at least show that this is actually a real thing that can be successful. The same thing for sourcing too. We've had a lot of clients where, they love the idea of sourcing. Our procurement sponsors love that idea, but the culture of the business isn't pro sourcing. It's more let the end business owner pick the supplier and go from there. I think there's ways that you can show them kind of these small steps of like doing spot bids or maybe just doing a negotiation at the point of renewing an existing SOW instead of trying to ham fist a mandate on competitive sourcing and then finding the business is running away from that mandate because they feel like they're not being heard or they don't have time and they're not being engaged in a conversation. It's just like, yeah, I understand you're saying that you don't have time, but let me show you what the technology can do to condense the sourcing process instead of months. That'll just take a week, 2 weeks, whatever that situation might be.
Yeah, and it's when you look at most organizations and where they are with services procurement, I would still say the vast majority of organizations are still at a low level of maturity. Clearly, there are some companies that have moved on, and some of the great companies that you've done work with certainly have got to a sophisticated level. But if I think of it in my head as like 10 notches on a volume switch of like, where these companies are, there's 10 notches of value they can add from being at baseline very unsophisticated. They don't necessarily need to be turned all the way up to 10 straight away. They can start hitting 3, 4. They're getting massive value out of it, and they can
Absolutely.
ramp it up as they go and like add in more sophisticated things. So yeah, I think the the interesting thing that for me that you mentioned around that, or the particularly interesting thing, is pain points, and that
Yeah.
is another one. And this is something where sometimes it's a struggle. You certainly from as a tech vendor point of view, when you're talking to these client organizations, sometimes organizations just say, "Show me the shiny," show me a demo, and it's like really we have learned over the years that the most effective way to support customers or even just have that conversation is to understand those pain points, because they are going to be there's going to be ultimately feel like the same probably 10, 15 pain points are going to exist kind of for everybody, but the recognition of which pain points are actually important seems to really vary from company to company. Have you experienced that as well?
Yeah, 100%. I'd say, my last role, I'd probably say at least 25% of my time was actually doing what I call just like workshops, right? For that same situation. We initially talked about our service and they want to see the tech demo. And, at that time we were like the service component of the technology component. So for me, it's like, oh, the technology is great, but, there's people that are doing some of the work here. Let me show you what we can do there. So I think to kind of nip that in the bud, we started taking this position of like trying to do workshops first, right? To really tease out what the issues are and then coming back, or at least in that, even you can even do it in that point in the workshop. Because there's a lot of people that we're all impatient now. Like we want to know like what could it look like. So I've then led these workshops where we start using it. First half of it is really to understand what the overall organizational objectives are, right? Then teasing out the pain points from the stakeholders. And to my earlier point, that workshop would be with those key sponsors, but we always, always encourage them to include some of the key business owners as well too, so they can hear it from the business. And it's been interesting that in a lot of those situations, we would hear some debate between the business owners and our procurement HR sponsors on what the issues actually are, right? So, and that's good. That's a good outcome in that conversation for them to really start hearing each other as much as it is them hearing us, right, as providers. Um, but then in that, once you start teasing out what the pain points are, if you're ready for it and if we prep well, you could actually then, okay, great. Now that I hear that XYZ are the actual major issues for you, let me now focus your point in the demo on these functionalities versus it being this very generic demo, right? And same thing for on the service side. Great. Like, let me show, in addition to technology, this is what the people component of this could do on your behalf, right? To really provide a really great solution. So I think whenever possible, like having that dialogue, I know that it takes a lot of time, right, from prospective buyers, but I think it's certainly worth that time. And I think it's really is more engaging, solution-based conversation versus it being this transactional pitch that probably isn't going to really hit, right? Or on both sides, it doesn't hit for us, but it also it doesn't really help the buyer think through and really kind of deep dive into like what their core issues are to help them with their business case for what they're trying to do.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. We created this mechanism, effectively this thing called the Wheel of Pain. And it's funny. I've even got some like, stand-up ones that we use around tables and stuff like that, just to get people talking about the pains, whether it's like misclassification, poor scoping, the need to use AI, lack of governance and control, or lack of visibility over change requests, or rogue spend, whatever it might be. When you start drilling into the pain points, or you give people the chance to say, what are the things that really are the key issues for you as a specific organization? Again, it plays into what we were talking about before, the fact that it's a common problem, and the set of problems are probably common across every organization, but the specific drivers are going to be different from organization to organization. And they're also going to depend on, the organizational culture, the structure, what's the existing technology, how a team's set up, where does responsibilities lie for different parts of the process of buying and executing, their service engagements. Which takes me into the second point that you brought up, which I think is really critical, which is this idea around solutioning. And
Yes.
I just think that's so important. And you said to me previously something that I really liked it, which was we were talking about the kind of evolution of services procurement within the market and the evolution of people's understanding. And I was talking about the enlightened ones, which is our kind of terminology that we use for people that go, I know we've got this problem. I, I, I'm going to take ownership of it, or I've got ownership of it. I want to do something about it, and I'm going to get, the buy-in, and I'm going to move it forward. Um, and I was talking about that, you said it's all about the people who are open to solutioning.
That's right.
And it's a great point that you make with that, because being open to solutioning means also being open to having that dialogue about what's the actual problem in the first place. I've seen, and I'm sure you will have seen this as well, but I've seen plenty of companies really benefit when they've got a group of people on a call, and the vendor, whether it's a solution provider or a tech provider or both, working together, are asking the questions around that pain statement and really drilling into it and almost getting the answers for the company for the first time, where they're
Right.
hearing somebody from compliance say, but hang on a minute, but this is an absolute nightmare for us. Or actual engagement managers talking about the need for speed to market, or what's stopping them getting the work done, or whatever it might be. I think it helps companies work through the process of getting their own minds in order as to the problem can seem tangled, complicated, really massive, but breaking it down to those pain points, um, and is part of being open to actually then solutioning. Because as you say, otherwise, just from a pure tech point of view, but the same applies to a service, you've got this big service that can effectively do, the dial all the way up to 10 of like absolute excellence, top level, super sophisticated, but it starts from one. You're going to show everybody all 10. It's like, that not everybody's ready for that. And it's not every single pain point that they want to address at this moment in time. So if you've got that information up front as a solution provider, whether it be service tech or combined, that is the magic in this stuff, where you can really look at that and say, okay, well, let's just show you what you need to see and have a much more engaging conversation. But Do you feel like more people are open to that type of solution in conversation now?
I think nowadays, yeah, I think there's definitely more. It's like we talked about before. Obviously, like within the core HR procurement sponsorship ecosystem, the concept of this is certainly here now, right? I think a lot of it ties based on the experience of those folks in the circle, but also the level as well too. I think these solutions, I 100% with you that these solutions absolutely launch. There is complexity to it, but I think the key to it is having great partners to unpack complexity, right, and kind of deal with it in kind of a long-term roadmap, right? None of these are solutions that you flip on and it magically meets all of your goals. It's like I said before, a lot of times on, these service procurement solutions, there'll probably be like a baseline starting, combination of services that are right for the customer, and then they need to evolve after that because the baseline is what gets you the data, right? Or at least that initial buy-in, or at least that pilot population for you to start showing, hey, we had a really great outcome for this. Now let's truly blow this out and transform it to something that's completely enterprise-wide, right? And it's only possible by doing it in that first phase. I've seen, some of these customers that, well, hey, if I'm going to do this, I want to do big bang. That can potentially be, something that can work, but that requires such a heavy amount of buy-in from so many different stakeholders, not just executive sponsors, HR procurement, be the business. It could be a lot of technologies because, all of our solutions touch all these other technology integrations and payments and contracting, things like that. So those things can definitely happen, but if you're in an organization where maybe you're not quite there yet, maybe starting off with more of like kind of that minimal viable product first to get it in will really be more of a way to then show that this is something that really can happen in our organization, and let's kind of advance it and mature it from there. But to go back to your original, question, I think now it's definitely gotten better for sure. I think just because people have heard the term service procurement and they want to know more about it. But I think it is really getting to the people that they want to know more about it, but they also are prepared to understand that I need to then be engaged in like these workshops, right? In these dialogues to really understand and solution for it versus an expectation of someone's like, hey, I've heard about the service procurement thing. You provider, tell me about it. And I'll just say, yeah, it doesn't seem right for us, like, and they kind of deal with it in more transactional basis, right? It's like a technology to flip on or off. And that's certainly not what this is. So I think a lot of it's just like getting people to be more receptive to, yes, there's definitely a need. Let's get you into that mindset of you've identified an issue. Let's kind of now go on the journey of solution together to create a really great solution for you.
Yeah, I mean, if I was suddenly put in the position of being in an organization and not having the background that I've got in services procurement and being tasked with it and thinking, how the hell do I even wrap my head around what the problem is? I would actually take advantage of people like yourself, people like me, and providers like those that we work for and have worked for, and actually use those conversations to really just like work out what's going on. And I would advise anybody to do that in the sense that, there is expertise out there. And as long
Absolutely.
as you're not just going into a situation where someone's just going to be selling at you, which doesn't work for this, and in fact, that's the last thing that people like us want to be told is, hey, sell it to me. A bit like you say, the situation you're describing, because the amount of times I've heard people say, we don't have a problem with services procurement. And then you show them a wheel of pain and they go, oh, that's a nightmare. That's really causing us problem. This is an absolute disaster. Our C-suite are really worried about that. And you're like, well, that's just a different way of looking at it.
Yeah, no, 100%. As you're saying that, I brought up this other point that I was thinking through too is, we certainly have clients that maybe they are asking for their external help, but maybe it was with those more typical consultancies, right? Like the Big Four, because they certainly provide these types of guidance. And, I always strike the balance. These type of suppliers come to service agreement programs. They can be 100% great partners as well. But I'd say to give us credit, I think what differentiates us as, consultant partners compared to these big consultancies is that I've seen the output of some of these recommendations that these big four consultancies provide to some of their clients, where especially when it comes to service experience space, if they're trying to get maybe some big cost savings, a lot of times it can be honestly like a very generic recommendation of great, oh, you're looking to make cost savings, really done in staff augmentation. On the services side, consolidate these 100 suppliers into these three master vendors, right? And it's just like very Yes, that could work, but in my opinion, a lot of it could be a bit of a ham-fisted recommendation. And then honestly, then a lot of times those consultancies are just plopping this recommendation over to the procurement sponsors and they're not going to execute it. The consultancy, they're kind of leaving it to them to do that. And so the sponsor is left with, okay, I understand that this could work, but I need help in actually getting it done as well too. So I think that's where we can fit in. Like we actually are experts in this specific space, can provide some more nuanced recommendations on technology, functionalities, on services that can get to a more prescribed way for getting cost savings, whatever that goal is, outside of a more generic recommendation. And probably then the most important thing is then actually executing it, right? As a technology provider, your technology actually does the execution of it. Service provider, same thing as well too. We provide that people actually do the work on their behalf. And I think that's really what the differentiator is when you kind of, if you're on the buyer side, you're trying to think of partners to engage with, is definitely coming to the specialists really to get the solution that will really work for your organization.
Yeah, and yeah, without that execution, with just a nice big kind of report dumped on somebody's desk that's very generic, it's really potentially a bit of a waste of time and money if that sort of thing is happening. And I think this is where it's interesting to see more of the kind of workforce solutions traditionally would have been regarded as staffing companies, but now more workforce solutions type organizations have really upped their game when it comes to services procurement. The idea of workforce solutions companies having people within their organization who are actually like genuine procurement folk with expertise
Exactly.
in this area. I'd say that was very rare back in the day. Um,
Yes.
but now it's something that people are really addressing and are kind of saying, well, hey, we have to do this. This is table stakes now. We've got to have
Exactly.
internal expertise, people that understand this and can sit down with the client and can talk about it and can listen to them and say, and how are you doing this? And they can say, well, at my previous company, I did it this way, or at X and Y other companies that I've worked with, these are the ways they address those problems. Or okay, that's an interesting, but they can talk the procurement language, and people like yourself, who, although you're not necessarily, from a procurement background originally, your expertise in services procurement is something that the way that people learn about procurement and the way that even procurement teams are structured or historically have been structured wouldn't necessarily have given that many people the type of expertise that really just focuses in on what are the problems that exist when you're actually trying to buy and manage outsourced services. And it's just got so big now because, it's a more service-based economy globally. Work is moving towards more outcome, output-based scenarios. Organizations need this flexible external capacity and capability. Um, it's like such a massive part of how organizations get work done. And on average, 50% of organizational spend across all sectors, across all locations. So it's just too big for people to ignore. But the way that it's kind of crept up on companies,
Yes.
because
Yeah.
organizations haven't been structured in procurement to say, this is how we buy goods, this is how we buy people, and this is how we buy services. Whereas I feel like that's there's more of a conversation going on around that now because the contractual mechanism by which you engage these suppliers is different if you're buying services. Generally, it's something like a statement of work type, output driven arrangement versus goods and materials, where it might be a bill of materials or a standard goods based contract versus people-based stuff where you're either hiring someone as a permanent employee or you are hiring a contractor, an individual. You're hiring Johnny Dunning, Joe David for a period of time, and it's that individual on that with no, and you're managing and controlling it, etc. So
Yeah.
I think the emergence of this expertise within the MSP world and some of the kind of BPO and consulting firms we're seeing moving more towards this, but definitely the MSPs have been are focusing on it now, and I feel like that it's really ramped up in the last 2 years, significantly ramped up. Um, but yeah, that idea of you can only have this conversation with one of the big four consulting firms, it definitely wouldn't be the only suggestion I would give to an organization. I would say, hey, look, there's some specialist providers out there now who you absolutely should be talking to, and maybe you should be talking to a few people to get your head around this. But I think that's also the value of having this type of conversation with somebody like you with your level of expertise and just exposing that to people to sort of say, hey, look, there's people out there who've run multiple programs. who've dealt with lots of customers and have seen this stuff. These are the people you need to be engaging with if you're even thinking about doing this, because the expertise out there is out there, which kind of leads me on to the area I want to come on to next, which is just the fact that it is actually possible to do this. It's gone from something that a lot of people just sort of think it's too hard. Other people don't seem to be doing it. We're just going to leave it in the too hard to do bucket, and we can just walk away from that. It's too difficult. Forget that. That is very much no longer the case. But before we get onto that, just a couple of points you made, which I thought were really interesting. You talked about the different stakeholders that you've engaged with in these organizations. And for me, again, that comes back to this concept of the enlightened ones. Because you can't always say, in my experience, it's going to be this type of company in this location, in this industry sector, and it's going to be the CPO or it's going to be the head of indirects. Because firstly, procurement teams are structured, they're not uniformly structured in any way.
Yeah.
Even finance teams across organizations are structured differently, but not that differently. Procurement teams, there can be a huge variation in my experience as to how they're structured. And
Yes.
also because services procurement is not something that necessarily every company has got a dedicated team or a dedicated person who's like, that's your responsibility, which I think will be the case in the future. I'm seeing more of this coming along. The
Agree.
responsibility is kind of diffused within teams. So sometimes it might be somebody who is reporting into the CTO, procurement excellence, CPO. It could be the CIO. It could be the CFO that's driving it, or it could just be a really smart, switched on and driven global category lead for professional services, for example, that's saying,
Right.
"Hey guys, we can do this better." But it's it. Is that something you've noticed, that kind of diffusion of responsibility and lack of kind of standardization?
Yeah, 100%. As you're talking, I was thinking that's right because I'd probably say 25% of the procurement sponsors that I've worked with, the services piece was just maybe one of three different categories I manage. And the funny thing is, it always seems to be travel and expense, and then maybe like events, things like that. And then I would always talk to them like, that's such a weird combination. Of like, and what their honest reaction was like, well, that was just kind of the combination of when we added the numbers of the spend of this, and this kind of made sense. So there really wasn't necessarily like a true strategy behind it. It's like, hey, this person has more capacity. Let's add on these other categories of spend that really have nothing to do with professional services at all. But I think it goes to your point where uh, we have a lot of sponsors that they're great and I'd say what they want is they really see the opportunity in the service and procurement space, and that's why they're excited about the solution because they could blow that out more and make that their full-time job, and then offload the time and expense management to somebody else on their team. Because quite frankly, I think this is the more interesting category to be in. Anything that has a combination of services and people, I think is super dynamic that a lot of procurement sponsors want to be part of, right? It engages a lot of different skill sets outside of it just being, transactional buying of widgets and things like that, or managing software contracts. So I definitely have seen that, and you're right. I think based on the organization, maybe it's not even the CPO this rolls into. It's like I said before, a lot of times it actually is more the IT organization, right? Because I've seen enough of previous clients where the IT providers have so much criticalness to their business that they've actually separated that relationship from the procurement organization. Not completely, right? The procurement usually had still like a support role, but the true ownership, they created their own internal IT vendor management teams, like all their own kind of internal function, because they needed to control this at the spend of suppliers themselves. So it can really change from customer to customer, right? And it just goes to the whole idea of really hearing that specific client's unique needs and understanding, to your point, there likely are over the 10 overriding pain points they're experiencing. They're probably experiencing a lot of these, but what's specific to them that now we can create a bespoke solution for.
Yeah, and I feel like with the people that you're talking about, where they're really grabbing hold of this, and then maybe they want to focus on services procurement and drop some of those other areas. I feel like it's a huge opportunity because it's still early in the maturity of this market. So I feel like there's a real opportunity for people to make a name for themselves. And
Absolutely.
and some of the people that I've seen go through and run successful programs, they're going to be the ones who are on the speaking circuit. They're going to be
Exactly.
the ones that are going around all the conferences and people want to hear what they did and understand it and try and replicate it and learn some of the lessons that they've learned by them kind of taking a risk. putting their head above the parapet and just going for it. And I think the other side of it is getting hold of that services procurement element is going to be very good for their careers for another reason, not just because people haven't done it and it's new and they'll get loads of benefits, but for me, it's because it's truly strategic in the
Exactly.
sense that this is what they're trying to optimize. I would say is a significant part, a significant element of how competitive that organization is in their own market. Like if they can get really good suppliers and they have great relationships with them and they've got a fantastically resilient supply chain and they've got the new capabilities that are, required covered through their supply chain, and they can get to market quickly and they can get good value and they can get good performance out of it, they're going to outcompete other players in their own market who are still stuck in the dark ages and maybe thinking about doing a bit of headcount tracking.
Yeah.
So I think there's huge rewards for people, and I'm sure you've probably seen cases where people have built up excellent reputations in their own organizations by doing something that maybe people thought wouldn't work or would be really difficult, and actually getting great results out of it.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, this is just it's a dynamic, interesting space, like services. And to your point, it's the combination of people, the service that are being provided. Almost everything that's in this category has a direct, even though it's called indirect spend, tied to usually what the end business of that company is, right? The managing the technology providers of that provide the infrastructure of the technology that your company provides, right? Or managing these consultants that provide really important advice for the key critical business decisions your executives are making for their own products, right? These are all things that if you're looking to become a leader in the space, there's so much like dynamic parts of it that make it like incredibly interesting that I'd want to be in if I was on the buyer side of the house because it's just a lot more interesting, I'd say. Like, obviously I'm not downplaying all the other important parts of procurement, those, the transactional, widgets, things like that. But I think for a certain type of person that likes that dynamicism, this is 100% a great opportunity. And to your point, if you get a couple of really good success stories of launching a successful services program, for their career, there's so many other organizations that are looking for that subject matter expertise to do the same thing with their organization. Because your point, I think there's still this mystique of it's too complicated to do this, but I know that's not for a case that's not the case. Um, you know, when I was with my former employer, half of our client base had at least some sort of service procurement solution, right? There are different levels of maturity, right, and sophistication, but even those clients that were still at that baseline, they were still in a better spot of at least having a foundation to eventually go into that more sophisticated space when they're ready, right? But then the clients are in that really leading edge, doing competitive sourcing, using AI to address misclassification. They really end up being those stars that we see in the circuits, right? ProcureCon and CBUS, that are really, being able to, show and highlight their expertise for the entire industry.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's that huge opportunity there for people. Um, One of the things that also I find interesting is when I look at this from a kind of like traditional procurement point of view, you mentioned about a lot of the time this being kind of seen as being lumped into indirect spend.
Hmm.
Um, I find that fascinating. Obviously, I've not come from that. I've come from a technology, procurement technology background rather than a practitioner type background. And I know there are obviously clear reasons, clear value in this kind of direct versus indirect um, analysis, partly from a financial point of view and partly from a procurement point of view, but from a running the business point of view. Um, but I do feel like it's possibly it's overly kind of simplistic or binary in the sense that if you're talking about BMW, then the majority of their direct spend, a lot of their direct spend is going to be goods and materials and engine parts and bits for cars. And your indirect spend is going to be services that help run the business and other stuff. But there will be definitely a bit of crossover. But if you're like a big global building consultancy like WSP, your direct spend is all services. Building consulting firms, architectural consulting, surveying consulting, all that sort of stuff, which is basically becomes your end product, subcontract, services engagements, and your indirect spend is goods not for resale. So I find it really interesting when you actually, because that's one of the things that I'm kind of a little bit challenging to say, should you be thinking about goods, people and services, or should you be thinking about direct versus indirect? And I think that the world is moving so rapidly and the services are growing so rapidly that I think that's why this emphasis on services is really growing because, and the only reason that people like you and people like me have been involved in it, the only reason why we built a technical solution, for example, is because there was a problem. And
Exactly.
we started off in the public sector,
Yeah.
but there was a problem where there was this professional services and consulting frameworks, and there's nothing to underpin it. People couldn't do it. Like you said, in those early programs, people are going, well, what about if we need to manage a statement of work? So I think that's been really fascinating. And I agree with you. Of course, other areas of procurement are hugely important, direct materials, for example. But on my argument on that is, I feel like that's a pretty well solved problem. You know,
Yes.
you've got this Amazon style buying experience, you've got catalog buying, guided buying, the technology. I would argue from a technology perspective, the procurement technology, the suites, the source to pay, procure to pay suites have been predominantly geared towards that kind of they come out of the ERP, manufacturing, and it's very much geared towards goods and materials. And services has always been this thing that's kind of like too difficult or it's secondary. But in the meantime, it's been growing. So I do feel like, of course, those other areas of procurement are super important, but I feel like they're pretty well catered for. It's like if you look at the contingent workforce market. I mean, obviously, the big VMS providers and the MSP solutions started in kind of like very earliest late 90s, kind of like beginning of the 2000s. That's a pretty well buttoned down solution these days.
Yeah, I
Whereas if
agree.
you compare the services side of it, it's still at that early age of maturity, I would argue.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree. Yeah. No, it's interesting you bring it up because when we talk about, the value of service program, we talk about that whole rubric of, you don't think about direct, indirect, talk about like people-based, versus, goods or, how to kind of differentiate that. But I think you're right. I think, the more that we can get organizations to start thinking about it in those terms, I think it actually would probably hit more in the way that their businesses are looking to engage with these type of services. I think there's probably some legacy, into your earlier point where some of the original kind of mind, or I guess architecture was direct, indirect, maybe like CapEx, OpEx, and it needs to fit in a bucket from an accounting perspective. But I think that's something that's already accounted for, to your point, where maybe it needs to think about, don't let these kind of existing technologies hinder your way of thinking about how a really great service procurement solution can meet your needs. So I bring it up because I think there's been certainly many instances where we've talked to customers about a service procurement solution with a technology, and a lot of times, like, hey, for our indirect category, we already use the enterprise ERP, right, to manage all of this. And okay, I understand that, but when you say you're managing, what are you actually doing on the services space? And it's like, oh, we can get a spend report, if that, right, if that with. And then you start poking into any level of granularity, and certainly nothing about the people aspect of it at all. But I think, a lot of times maybe those original, maybe legacy leaders in those space, like, oh, we've already addressed it. And we also don't want to, in their head, introduce in their view like another technology to complicate the solution, which I think is our job to poke more holes into that. Because I think at this point, yes, there'd be an introduction of the technology, but you and I both know there's a lot of great, obviously, integrations that could go into place that you can still feed that data into a more enterprise ERP, so you have all that spent all together. I just truly don't believe that argument of like not wanting to complicate things is enough of value to not dive more into services with all of the benefits you can get into that with a huge amount of spend that's untouched. Because to your point, yes, the enterprise ERP has really good hold of like goods and services, but you have all the levers, all the cost savings mechanisms, very well oiled. There's not much more you can do in that space. But now there's other category they're managing your ERP that you admittedly say that you don't have a lot of visibility into. So let's kind of get the other enabling technologies and get more out of it so we can get even more cost savings. So you now squeeze everything you can. And I've made that same argument now in the, MSP space. We have so many, customers I think have done all they can on the staff aug side as far as like reducing rates and trying to do rate cuts. Really, the bang for the buck will be in services for them. And the amount of spend and the way that contracting is done, it is not going to be as much of a disruptive change as I think a lot of potential sponsors think it can be, because there's honestly so much margin a lot of times
Oh
in
my
these
God.
services contracts
Yeah, yeah,
where
yeah.
Yeah, the service suppliers will still make good money, right? And I as a provider, I always strike the balance. The service providers they're all great partners. They're not bad providers. I think also they a lot of times they just do what the business thinks they need to do. But it just calls up like that there is an opportunity for people that understand these kind of different mechanisms to get really great cost savings, get better control, and really hone in the service supplier community into those true strategic partners that are providing demonstrable value to the organization, right? And not just these veiled staff augmentation agreements or these suppliers that they're perfectly fine with not having any accountability and charging a huge markup on things, right? That was our job, right? As the kind of the experts and things to get really good engaged suppliers that they will benefit from it as well too, but really also like get a really well-run, cost-effective, meeting the business needs service and procurement solution for the end customers.
Yeah, and like we said earlier, other organizations are getting on top of this. What I would urge anyone who's even considering this to think about is, can you compete effectively in your market if you don't do this? Because you need to get work done. And this is where I think it's really interesting the way that services procurement straddles and workforce parts of the business, strategic workforce planning, kind of potentially HR talent acquisition type functions or contingent workforce type functions, and pure procurement functions. But from a CEO's point of view, they've got options as to how they get work done. I can use my permanent workforce, I can use contractors and temps, I can use AI, I can outsource it to my services supply chain. But if you've got a big chunk of that that isn't buttoned down, and in large organizations, typically what, 6 to 10 times the amount of spend as contingent workforce. In smaller organizations, maybe 4 to 6 times, something like it's a massive liability. It's a massive commitment. If you haven't got that button down, I personally think that, as a CEO, I would be, that would give me sleepless nights thinking, okay, have we got the capacity? How good is that capacity? What are we wasting the money? Do we even know what's happening? Do we even know who these suppliers are? What if something happens in the market that means I suddenly need them to do something else for me, or I suddenly need them to do more for me? Is that going to work? Are they going to do a good job? Are we going to be able to get it done in time? It's like that would keep me awake at night. I would want to have this stuff nailed because as an organization, they're spending a lot of money on it and it is a significant factor in driving their success. So I just think that's where I think it's become more of understood around those facets of the market, which is why, and it's kind of coalesced into this thing that is services procurement, and people can't quite get away with now just going, oh, well, we've got that PO level information, and I've seen it on calls myself where one stakeholder might be kind of edging towards that argument, and another stakeholder at the same company might say, hey, that's not good enough. And I find that really interesting when companies are starting to like, have a bit of an internal dialogue where they're saying, where there are people like kind of saying we really should do something about this. And that's something that I've definitely seen accelerating. And you probably would have seen that. I certainly saw that less when we was kind of starting out, say, kind of like 5, 6 years ago. But I'm sure for you, if you look back right to those early programs, it probably wasn't anything like that kind of discussion.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. I think to your point, a lot of it's like, hey, yeah, even 5 years ago, a lot of individual stakeholders like, hey, the baseline visibility is good enough, but I think it's also at that time they still had other levers they could pull, right? Maybe there was still at that point more levers they could pull for cost savings and staff log or like other categories. But it's like I said
Yeah.
before, like now that stone cannot be squeezed anymore, and they need to be creative and have more tools at their disposal, right, to enact different types of cost savings or just like management, more sophisticated management of spend. And this is the area that I don't want to call it the wild, wild west, but there's just a lot of untapped opportunity, right? If you just get the right technologies and services in place that can really kind of unearth those opportunities and then have the execution strategy on top of it.
Yeah, I agree. And like you say, kind of don't want to be too kind of like over the top with saying it's the wild wild west, but we run a survey every year on services procurement and what people's main concerns are. uh Rogue spend and missed savings is number one, has been number one for the last 2 years. We'll see what comes out in 2026, but it's this kind of chaos
Yeah.
that is going on in a lot of companies that they are trying to get on top of, where it's Excel spreadsheets, Word documents, scanned, signed PDFs that may have milestones, that may not, and the milestones have probably changed, and none of it's in a system, and you'd have to look at
Exactly.
the actual document. All that sort of stuff is as you and I know, far too common, and these are the types of problems that the switched on companies are really trying to get on top of, and they are doing that. And that's kind of what I wanted to come on to next, in the sense that you and I have seen the market evolve, but also I certainly have, and I'm sure you have as well, seen some great examples where when people do get this right, it's all the justification in the world for what they set out to do, in the sense that the it's a greenfield, and it's not like tweaking a contingent workforce program and what sort of value you're going to get out of it. The value that organizations get out of doing this is immense, and just be interesting to hear your view on how you would kind of articulate to people in the market that are thinking about doing this, that are thinking maybe it's not possible, or it's not going to deliver the results I want. What would be your message to them in terms of where you've seen this has been successful and doable?
Yeah. Yeah, I think for our customers that were starting off in that service procurement journey, I think a lot of the reason they're able to do that is because they were able to get some quick wins, right? Probably the biggest thing was around cost savings in a couple different areas. Like my very first success as the original client I talked about back in 2008, when we first released that service procurement solution, we had this really interesting opportunity. We had just rolled out the service procurement solution. Like I said before, it was a very baseline solution, just managing the statements of work. But our procurement sponsor had an opportunity of this consulting supplier that did both staffing and IT consultancy, that already had essentially a verbal award for a very large IT contract. But we were about to load, right, this SOW into the VMS and got some of the baseline, data, included workers, the rates, things like that. And I actually was a individual contributor. I was a special at the time when I saw it. And I was actually about to load it into the VMS when I realized, like, hey, the rates here just seem super off. Like, I don't know why they're agreeing to pay this. One, because this company also works on the staff log side, but I know for a fact there are a bunch of other companies that could do this work much more competitively. So I actually had the opportunity, just based on the relationship, to run probably what in our program at that time, the very first what we called like a quick bid. And at that point, it was actually completely manual. There was no sourcing technology yet in a VMS to do that. But we basically did this quick and dirty mini RFP where we're like, hey, we invited that same supplier to actually formally bid with rates on these, different roles, this collection of IT services. And then we engaged based on our data, right, in the staff log MSP, these two other IT staffing suppliers that basically were able to provide really competitive rates with the understanding they're basically getting now like a bulk award, right, of work. So we did it, and when they actually went with a different supplier, they realized a huge amount of cost savings for an IT project that was going to be there for 2 years. That their CPO at the time actually used, like, hey, this is an amazing outcome of actually is doing competitive sourcing. And this is what at the time the organization where it's like I said before, the idea of actual competitive sourcing, they liked it, but they just simply weren't able to do it because it's very reactive to the business. They just need to get work done. But we were able to do that over the course of a couple of weeks. So I brought that as an example because that actually then was a true demonstratable example that the CPO brought to other business units of, hey, give the program a chance, right? Let's kind of get more of this data in the services procurement program because I'm sure that story is repeating itself multiple times in different business units. And that really kind of helps drive more adoption because the business units, the other managers of the business unit and other business units, they wanted to see similar results, right? Because they obviously had cost savings goals they had to have. So I think a lot of it is, starting off with those quick wins, and that will really kind of then be those little mini case studies that bring the rest of the business along. And we have another example where it wasn't even competitive sourcing. We just were able to get some really great cost savings just through negotiation of extensions. It's the same thing. Like we were loading these SOWs within the VMS. We got some baseline visibility of what's going on. It just had one of our specialists being just curious, right? Of like, hey, great. I've been working with this manager. They've asked me to extend this 3-month statement of work 4 times already. It's now into year two. Why does it continually get extended? And after doing some conversation, right, with the business, you start realizing it was kind of just an open PO, or in these cases, the supplier actually was not meeting their deliverables, right? That weren't in the VMS at that time, but in the business agreement between the supplier and the manager, they weren't meeting their expectations, and the supplier was just kind of getting away with extensions with additional budget, right, for something that was their fault. And that really shouldn't be the case, right? It's a statement of work. The supplier should get some risk. And then we had some great negotiation opportunity to have no cost extensions, right? And even that in itself saved a good amount. But it's also really just an example for the procurement sponsor to show this is a business behavior that we knew was happening, but we never had the data to show it, that we now are using as a way to advance the program forward. So again, I think a lot of it, if you're in a space where you want to do service procurement and you think it's too complicated, start off with the small, quick examples, and that really help advance things further.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It comes back to what you were kind of talking about earlier with regards to like whether people go big bang with these programs. I've seen a lot of success. You talked about like having a baseline
Yes.
solution. I've seen a lot of success where people have gone piecemeal through different categories or different departments or different functions with that kind of baseline approach rather than a big bang approach. And I think for me, what can unstick the market, where I feel like a lot of companies have sort of said, oh, it's too difficult, it's too big to move, there's too many people who have to be involved in it, it's too much spend to try and get the program through. I feel like those things have like choked up the market a bit where people have just got stuck. And for me, agility, innovation, speed to market are the things that are going to free that up, where people need to be enabled to do things on a smaller basis, get moving quicker, help build their business case. Because with some of these companies, if they look at it and go, yeah, we've got 4 billion in services procurement spend, that's a pretty big thing to get kind of signed off. Maybe you don't want to start with the whole 4 billion, but like you say, if you've got parts of the business that are trying this stuff out, if it's like the IT organization have got a really strong driver to get this sorted out, if they're doing really well with it, then it's certainly logical that someone who's in procurement excellence or operational excellence could look at that and go, the way that that department are handling statement of work engagements is amazing. We've got all these other statement of work engagements in these other categories. Why aren't we doing that? So I think you can get that kind of spread from that solid base of that baseline offering. Um, but I agree with you in terms of the kind of value drivers, and it starts with things even like scoping, just like the time savings. Like if you're
Yeah.
helping people with scoping, whether it's the tech or the service provider that's doing it, you can take people from taking 3 months to write a scope because they can't get round to it. We all know what it's like when you've got to start something from scratch. AI,
Yes.
massive, massive help on that side. And then when you were talking about the kind of competitive process, we see people making savings just by putting a target price against the project. So rather than just saying, here's the budget, they could just say, we'll specify a target price. And in a system or through a service, they could just say, the company might say target price is always 80% of budget.
Right.
Or even just making the supplier feel like they're going through a formal process
Exactly.
rather than just getting an email from Joe or Johnny to say, hey, here's a piece of work, write the spec for me.
Yeah, I think that's a key part of it too. The whole idea of trying to get more adoption for competitive sourcing. We've always told customers that we're a little apprehensive about it. We'll invite your incumbent, right, or your chosen supplier into it. And at the end of the day, if you still decide to go with them, that's totally fine. We're just asking you to go on this journey of this effort because at the very least, you could have them just sharpen their pencil, right? And that's still a good outcome in itself. And as a tangential outcome, if that makes that buyer a little bit more aware of other suppliers that can do similar types of work, that is a great outcome. But to your point, there's other benefits of certainly in that scenario, that incumbent supplier and the buyer, to your point, maybe when they thought the deal was just going to be a sole source, they didn't have a heavy amount of investment of actually creating a properly scoped out statement of work because it was essentially just a PO.
Yeah.
But that exercise of like, hey, this is going to go to bid, you now have to actually define what your requirements are, have the supplier provide the response, and then turn that into a well-written statement of work. There's a lot of power in that and having the definition of the scope. And that goes into that other example where we did show in those patterns of these habitually extended statements of work that there was really no defined scope at all. So just in this whole practice of enforcing templates, right? And just like, hey, if you said this is a professional service agreement, it needs to use this template that has these specific milestone deliverables, or it's like I said earlier, at least something that has some sort of supplier risk on it that is enforced by the technology and by the process, and not just allowing the business, which quite frankly, they don't want to write statements of work themselves, right? They probably are just having the supplier do a lot of the work and they just kind of rubber stamp it. just providing some governance to help the business get that statement of work, which is important, out much more quickly, so that becomes not a resistance to that. Like they're not saying, I don't have time for this, because this contracting process can be a lot shorter than you think it is, even more effective than you passing this email back and forth with a supplier of a statement of work and it just being on supplier paper with all the risks that are associated to that.
Yeah, and at a fundamental level, you're going to have every company's going to have their key suppliers, and they don't want to upset them. But there's no reason why they can't keep them honest,
Mhm.
because just by applying the correct processes, as you say, cutting out these unnecessary variations and stuff like that. I've seen companies save millions per year just in reduced settlements,
Yes.
where stuff gets to the end of the project, no one's happy, there's a big extra bill, and it's not even a good result, but there's still all this cost. I've seen organizations bring that down to like basically zero from being a significant cost. So
Absolutely.
I think, yeah, and understanding those sort of things like, okay, well, we love this supplier and we think they're doing great work for us, but what's their actual win ratio? Oh, their win ratio seems pretty high. What's their average cost overrun? Oh, that's interesting. So how are we contracting with them? It's just, I just think it would be, in my opinion, negligent for companies not to take that approach. They can still love that supplier, and if they're measuring the performance of that supplier effectively, they should hopefully get the results to see that supplier is amazing. Let's give them more work. Let's get other departments, make other departments aware of this supplier, because we should be doing more with this lot because they're doing a great job.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting too because I 100% agree with that, and I think it's starting. I'm not going to say it's there yet, but when we talk about the benefits for buyers, right? But I also do think that we're getting more, since we're getting more of these, value-added service procurement programs. We're getting to a point where enough of these suppliers, there's some smart services suppliers are seeing, the wins and the change, and they're saying, hey, for me to, this is what the client is putting in place, and versus being this big detractor and trying to complain to whatever executive level relationship you have, here's the things you can do to actually just kind of go and play within the program. They can get a lot of massive benefit too, to your point. If they start demonstrating through that data that we get through the program, that they are in fact one of the best suppliers for meeting deliverables on time, right? Not having all these ridiculous extensions, right, for cost, using all that milestone project data to show that they are one of the top suppliers. We can arm them with that information too to get more business in that organization or actually for other companies that they're working with as well. I think I bring that up because that was definitely when staffing MSPs came in place, right, in the 90s, early 2000s. It was the exact same situation, right, where probably only started with more of the transactional skill sets. And then there's this whole idea that IT staffing suppliers were this amazing thing that can be touched and no one wanted to do that. But then obviously now every staffing company works in the MSP space. I think that same evolution will happen, right, in the service procurement space with the big four, the IT outsourcers. They're already in services programs. I manage dozens of programs with these companies in there. But I think at some point it's going to be more of this like understood thing that yes, they do always in fact play in these programs. And it goes to this, the other point around difficultness of deploying services programs. I do think there's a lot of potential sponsors that that's actually their main worry is the relationship with these suppliers. But the idea of these programs is not a foreign thing anymore for these type of companies. So their strategies, obviously, you still need to first have the executive sponsorship on the buyer side, the whole strategy to get the suppliers to understand the benefits and get them in line. But I want to see the industry get to a point where those same service suppliers are seeing that same value that really good staffing companies have seen from staff log MSPs, right? It's going to happen. And a lot of it's going to be through giving the data, not only to the buyers, but also the suppliers and showing them the benefits of, hey, if you're a top supplier here, we can get you these opportunities at X, Y, Z other companies, right? And it'll benefit you as well. It's these solutions, it's a huge complex supplier ecosystem. It will only be successful if all of the best players on both sides are seeing benefit from it.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I sometimes, we'll get clients ask us, do you experience resistance from suppliers? The honest answer is no. We've had incredible feedback to companies that we work with from their suppliers when they've rolled out these service procurement programs, in the sense that, there's more clarity for them, there's more organization, it's easier for them to communicate. They're not getting caught out by contractual gotchas and things going awry in the projects. They're getting paid quicker. They've got
Yeah.
more visibility on stuff, that sort of thing, which is, the amount of times that suppliers just, some suppliers just forget to invoice. The project goes by and they just haven't invoiced it, and it's just kind of
Yeah.
it's we've seen a lot of support on that, and it's like when organizations are concerned and think, yeah, but what about my top level strategic suppliers? We've seen like won't necessarily say all of them, but you know, most of the big guys, they're already running through programs in our system with different customers. They're running fine with it, and it's great for them in terms of increasing that visibility, making their process more efficient, and actually building a better relationship with the business rather than necessarily just with an individual. They can still have that C-suite relationship, but they can also, prove how good, a service they're actually delivering to people.
Yeah.
So,
Absolutely.
yeah, I think the value does sit on all sides, but that's also where, for me, AI and technology can play a part. And I'd be interested in your viewpoint on that because for me, AI has done two things. So technology is required to support this process because you can't do it manually, big and complex, high volume data, lots of unstructured
Absolutely.
information, all that sort of thing. But a lot of organizations back in the day would always say it's just too difficult. I would say AI has done two things. One is it's made the fundamental argument of services procurement is too complicated, basically invalid. So
Yeah.
dealing with huge amounts of unstructured data, lots of it text-based, well, guess what? AI is brilliant at sorting that out. So sorry, that excuse is gone. And people know that. But also companies are saying, what are we doing with AI in procurement? Why aren't we utilizing it? This is a great area to take advantage of it. So it's taken away the excuse for procurement teams that this is just too difficult. The second thing it's done, it's enabled tech providers like us, and by virtue of that, service providers like yourself, it's enabled that service to have a much better user experience, and it's
Absolutely.
enabling much greater levels of adoption because you're making life easier for the buyer to write the scope. You're making it easier for the supplier to manage their interactions and keep on top of their projects and stuff like that. So for me, it's really about that kind of adoption and user experience. But when you look at the transition of kind of technology and AI in this space, what would you see as the ways that AI and technology has already and can in the future help move this market forward?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a huge impact, and I think fortunately, I've worked with a couple of programs where we launched, these AI solutions, in the past 5 years. Um, I mean, I think there's different ways that it's impacted the solutions in a really positive way. One is obviously like just the enablement for people to just focus on the more important things. The example that I've was brought up, we were able to develop a solution where, this whole idea of misclassification, right, has been around for quite some time. And in the 2000s, 2010s, I had projects over with customers where they'd give us these soft copy statements of work where we would literally have to highlight, through the highlighter or something that's a piece of paper, the specific data points or clauses that pointed to misclassification. And we're like, great, okay, I only have like three people I'm borrowing, right? From an operations perspective, we can maybe only tackle a couple hundred of these in the time constraint that we have. And we still got a really good output, but it's a very small sample size, right? And hence, like the potential cost savings is less. But nowadays, we have technologies that can, to your point, analyze hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of these statements of work, the unstructured data, highlight those key points that really then allow the people to focus on like the patterns, right, and the pictures, and really realizing really huge cost savings and a much bigger chunk, right? And I think we got to the point where that technology has been able to show enough of a big opportunity that is really raising the ears of executive level individuals, right? Like, oh, this is a huge amount. Whereas before, like, yeah, that's nice. That's maybe like a couple million cost savings, but oh, based on this, all this data we analyze, there's millions and millions of potential risk or cost savings that are available to us, right? So one, having technology be able to enable that has been huge, but there's definitely not like, on the front end from like a sourcing perspective that has added a huge amount of value, right? To your point of this whole idea. And I think that's the reason why a lot of this resistance historically is in place for competitive sourcing is a perception that if I, as a business owner, am agreeing to run an RFP, I am basically losing 3 months of my life, right? To run especially if it's a complicated IT project, right? There could be just so much into just the build of it, right? As a procurement practitioner, if they don't have the right templates and things like that, it could take, weeks, if not months, to go through a very complicated RFX. Whereas like using AI, enabling technology to actually write those RFPs much, much faster, right? And then also then use that to potentially recommend suppliers to invite into the RFP exercises. It condenses the timeline so dramatically that that whole resistance becomes a non-factor, right, to those business owners. And if anything, it becomes more interesting to them because like that technology in helping to build a really comprehensive RFP, it then in turn will create a much more developed scope of work, right? Then takes that effort off of the business owner to have to put out the effort building that statement of work as well too. So I think that's been huge in there. The other thing that I think has been interesting, it's been the concept of it has been around for a while. Like in the MSP space, the VMS space, we've had this whole idea of like guided buying solutions, right? Which I think for the longest time was really just more like this if-then logic
Yeah.
of hey, answer these kind of very, linear type set of questions, and based on how you answer the questions, we're steering it as staff log or services. I think there's been a lot more opportunity now, right, to actually have like these agents, right, or like an orchestration solution using all the data and other factors to provide these recommendations of different channels to go through. Now, it's been interesting to see those roll out, but I'm still, obviously I've a bit of a bias because I'm kind of the people part of this, a service provider part of it. I do think that those guided buying solutions have a lot of, and these orchestration solutions can have a lot of value, but I still think there's this need to have like a human in the loop. And I know for a lot of like AI diehards, that's like a don't say that type of thing, like the AI will do it. But I think we're at a point still in the world that people are still concerned about, yes, the AI can do a lot of great things, but I still need to have at least some touch of per people, right? Or somebody in there. So I trust not only is it just the technology saying this, but there's somebody that's providing a human look at this and giving me a really good combined piece of advice. And I think that's where you still can have like a really great experience of like condensing a guided buying solution, so a lot of it is on technology, but still having that touch of a person, whether it's an MSP or maybe it's somebody in the procurement organization that provides a, hey, great, based on what the AI said, it says that you should probably go down this path, but let me take this and have a conversation with you, Mr. and Mrs. Manager, because it could be that you could have just been saying the answers that you think get you into the outcome that you thought you needed versus having a really a good dialogue and actually help me understand exactly what are you trying to accomplish, right? And teasing out other details they probably aren't going to get through the AI on its own because you're only kind of feeding data that you want the AI to consume, right? It's kind of like bad data in, you can't expect it's going to give you an amazing outcome. You need to get a lot of wealth data from the data input, but also the additional data you get from the conversations that you have with those individuals.
Yeah, and in that kind of 3 point scenario, procurement, buyer, supplier, you've got people on the end of it in
Yeah,
each case, and it's those relationships and those individuals that need to be dealt with. So yeah, I think you make a really good point. But it's really exciting to start seeing this stuff being utilized, and the people's reticence of using AI or nervousness of using AI, or even people thinking, "Oh, is this going to take my job, or do I want to resist it?" It's melting away in the sense that people are becoming more used to using AI. And actually, if AI is behind the scenes making the user experience better, rather than it just being, we're just going to use AI, if it's used as an enhancement for a process and for a system and for a service, then I think that's the most effective way to use it because you're saying in every part of this life cycle, what is the most effective way that AI can be used to make it easier,
exactly.
faster, safer for that buyer to engage with that supplier. And as you say, there's people on the end of these people and IP based services, and the people that are buying them, and the people that are trying to help manage it. So I do think that's a really good point. Um, I guess just to kind of wrap things up, really, one of the last thing I wanted to really kind of pick your brains on, although I do think we could have probably about three or four other conversations. There's
Sure,
so much stuff
absolutely.
to talk about. Can you just give me a little bit of your take on the operational side of it in terms of when you look at it as a service provider, how does that component of it really add value? Because I sometimes feel that's a little bit taken for granted, maybe by organizations when they're going into this or where they're looking at a service provision. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, operations, that's my entire career. It's near and dear to my heart and, how I really got all this experience. But I think whether you're an organization that you don't, whether you have an MSP or not, right? The people that are on the ground actually executing the work are key on the actual success. So, I talked about a couple examples of doing these, misclassification projects, right? But the whole point of doing a misclassification project is to make the moves happen, right? Move it to staff log, get the cost savings. The technology, right, enables that and provides the great data to do that, but it's the people that define the roadmap and are the people that execute the work to actually realize the cost savings. And that's really that key combination, right? All of our solutions are a combination of our really amazing technology partners, but also people that know how to use that data or that process that's enabled by technology to actually get the final outcome done. And the misclassification projects I've done in the past couple of years, it was always a combination of this AI-enabled technology that would, point out the misclassification and provide a very high-level analysis. But it was then our people to great, hey, based on analysis, yes, there in fact is a misclassification issue. Now using our people-based experience and expertise, now this is the strategy to talk to these managers first, right? The sequence of conversations, the type of conversations and the first suppliers that we should target, right, for misclassification, reclassification based on our past history with them, right, and our relationships. Those things will not happen with technology alone. It needs to be people that power the conversation and actually then get that project over the finish line, and then getting the rate negotiations, getting the restructure, the statement of work, or getting those workers moved to staff augmentation, assignments and getting that final signature of all those things to realize the cost savings. And I think that's where a lot of this can fall. If you don't have the right operators, you will get a lot of these projects that the outcome ends up just being the data, right? And then people are just like, yep, this confirms everything that I always thought. That's nice to know. But then you're like, I don't have the bandwidth to do this. I don't have the expertise. And it just kind of sits up on the shelf and nothing really ever happens to it. And I think that's where the frustration starts driving, right, with those sponsors, but also probably from the executive level as well, too. Like great, you want to go with the Big Four to provide a cost savings recommendation. They said this, and now you're unable to actually execute it. Just having the right partners is incredibly important to making sure that actually happens.
Yeah, and it gets into that whole change management conversation, which is the critical part of it of like, you can have the best ideas in the world, but if you can't actually get on and do it, then you might as well not bother. But no, I think it's really good points, and um, I think I personally think this conversation, your points that you're putting across, there's a wealth of knowledge there. I think this is hopefully should be really interesting and useful for people who are considering this, thinking about it, and again, I would urge people that are thinking about this, have conversations with your peers, have conversations with service providers, technology providers, people who are expert in this space, because there are more and more people developing that expertise and coming out of the woodwork in this space, particularly when it comes to peer-to-peer conversations. Um, and that's how this whole thing advances. And there's so much opportunity for companies to benefit, and also for service providers and technology vendors to really build this market out and take it to the levels of maturity and value and savings and efficiency that you have in other areas, like the way that most organizations procure goods and like the way that most organizations run their kind of staff augmentation programs. So I think it's super, super exciting. Um, so just in terms of from your own point of view, you were sailing. I saw some stuff on LinkedIn. You look like you
Yeah.
were doing all kinds of fun stuff. What have you been up to most recently?
Yeah, no, so I had a great career with an amazing, MSP provider for 21 plus years. But I just got to the point where I need to just take a personal break, right? So I actually took a sabbatical for about a year, and travel has always been a huge part of what's important to me throughout my entire life. I was able to travel a lot for work to amazing places, but now I was able to take a whole year to kind of just travel to all types of places like on my own terms and just not having this kind of looming worry that I'm missing something out at work going on. So yeah, I always traveled to 7 different countries all throughout 2025. I'm based in the United States, so I also did road trips 4 times across country with my dog. Saw a lot of our
Nice.
national parks. It's just beautiful national parks in the United States, and also just spent a lot of time with family. So I had a really great time to just kind of truly decompress. But with all that, it kind of just got me to be able to really appreciate the experience I built in the industry over this 21 years, and we're really excited to get back into things. And that's what I'm doing now is just basically working as a kind of consultant, right, for organizations that are maybe trying to figure out that business case for service procurement. Also for providers that are looking to mature their offerings. This is, services is, what's happening in the future. And really just kind of taking that avenue. But it's been a really great time to take off, but I'm really excited to get back into things because to your point, there's a lot of cool, exciting things happening in the industry. And I'm really, really excited to see what's going to happen in service procurement specifically in the next couple of years.
Yeah, I think timing wise, and you just at the right place at the right time, in my opinion, in the sense of there genuinely are not that many people with your level of experience and expertise in this area. And you've that's hard won experience that you've built up over a number of years. And I think that's really exciting in the sense of what you can bring to other organizations, whether it's end organizations or service providers or technology providers alike in this services procurement niche. I think you can bring some real value to it. And I really appreciate you joining me for a conversation. And it's just, I want to celebrate the kind of knowledge and experience that you've built up, because I love it. I think it's fantastic, and it's really nice for me to talk to you and hear your take on things. Partly because when I'm listening to you talking about stuff, I'm thinking that's going to be really useful for people who maybe haven't had that type of conversation at this point in the market. So yeah, look, I really appreciate you coming and joining me for a chat today. What's the best way for people to get in touch with you? Is it LinkedIn, that sort of thing, really?
Yeah, LinkedIn is the best. Joe, David, it's like David, except I pronounce it differently. You just look that up. I'm on there. That's really the best way to get in touch with me. But no, likewise, I always enjoy these conversations because we've been speaking for an hour and a half, but it didn't feel like it. It was just really
Oh,
very
no.
conversational.
It's
Because we're
flown
obviously
past.
we're obviously
Absolutely
very
flown
passionate
past.
about this. Yeah, but it's been
But it's
great. I
been a
appreciate that.
real pleasure. And yeah, like I say, I really appreciate it, Joe. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Johnny.